The night smelled like smoke and sea salt. Backyard lights stretched across the lawn like lazy strings of gold. Laughter was already spilling through the humid Norfolk air before I even stepped out of my truck. I had flown home 2 nights ago after 12 months on deployment, but tonight was my father's idea of a proper welcome. A backyard barbecue, the Archer family's favorite theater for pretending everything is fine. I walked through the gate with a paper plate in one hand and the taste of jet fuel still somewhere at the back of my throat. Brittany was at the center of the crowd as always. My stepsister thrived under string lights and shallow attention. Her hair caught the light, her voice carried above the music. People leaned toward her because she was good at taking space. I had spent my life learning to hold mine quietly. She turned the moment she saw me. Her grin was too polished, too sharp. "So what's Sloan? You file paperwork for the Navy?" Her words cut through the easy noise like a match striking. Laughter followed quick and loud, bouncing off the fence like it had been waiting there. Half the table turned to look at me, some smiling, some curious. Not one of them had ever asked what I actually did. I wiped my hands slowly on a napkin. My uniform was clean civilian, jeans, black shirt. Nothing that said Lieutenant Commander. That was the point. I had learned long ago that wearing the uniform around them only gave Brittany sharper teeth. "No," I said quietly. My voice didn't need volume. It carried anyway. "I fly." For a second, the only sound was the pop of fat on the grill. Then Brittany threw her head back and laughed. "Oh, yeah. What's your call sign?" Her friends snickered. They thought this was a game. They thought I was playing. "Iron Widow," I said. "No more. No less." 3 syllables and the entire table shifted. Chairs creaked. The heat seemed to snap in place. I saw Helena's head lift. Commander Helena Kane, my stepmother, former SEAL team liaison. Her expression froze like the air had just dropped 10 degrees. She looked at me not as a stepdaughter, but as someone she recognized, someone she had once read about in a classified mission brief. The porch light caught the edge of her face. Her voice was level, low. The kind of voice that used to give men orders in places most people would never see. "Brittany, apologize. Now." The word "now" cracked through the night like a trigger pull. The laughter bled out of the crowd. I could hear the ocean breathing beyond the fence. Brittany's mouth hung open, her eyes flicking between me and her mother. For once, she didn't have a line ready. The silence wasn't awkward. It was heavy, familiar. The kind of silence I had lived in for years. My fingers curled loosely around the edge of my plate. I didn't need to say another word. I didn't need to explain who I was. Helena had already done it for me. That was the moment everything in this backyard shifted. The moment my stepsister realized the woman she had mocked didn't need to prove herself. She just needed to speak her name. If you were standing here, if this had been your moment, what would you have done when the person who laughed at you was ordered to apologize in front of everyone? I learned early that silence was safer. It wasn't something anyone told me. It was something I absorbed like the smell of salt in the air around Norfolk. My father had retired from the Navy when I was 9. He spent most of his days in the garage, sleeves rolled up, arms covered in engine grease, as if he could still feel the rhythm of aircraft engines through his bones. He wasn't unkind, but he was the kind of man who let quiet do the heavy lifting. I grew up listening to the creak of his wrench instead of his words. My mother died when I was 11. After that, the house filled with a different kind of silence. Not the steady kind, the hollow kind, the kind that sat on your chest at night and made it hard to breathe. When Helena came into our lives 2 years later, she brought her own kind of noise. Precise, controlled, sharp as a whistle on the deck of a ship. She was a Navy officer then, younger than she is now, always in pressed uniforms, shoes that clicked against the hardwood floors. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her voice carried the kind of weight that came from knowing she could make things happen. Brittany was already there, a permanent fixture at her side. She was 2 years younger than me and had the effortless glow of someone who'd always been told she was special. She wore that glow like armor. My father tried to build a family out of all those jagged edges. He cooked breakfast on Sundays, made jokes that fell flat, tried to bring us together around the same dinner table, but nothing glued clean. Brittany learned quickly that she could talk and people would listen. I learned that the quieter I was, the less damage hit me. She was the kind of girl who made the world revolve around her with a toss of her hair and a practiced pout. And the adults let her, even Helena, especially Helena. She wanted Brittany to have a bright future, a soft one. Mine was expected to be steady, useful, reliable. I was supposed to know my place and hold it without complaint. That's what my father called being strong. When I turned 16, I joined the junior ROTC program at school. My father nodded when I told him. Helena tilted her head and said, "That's disciplined." Brittany rolled her eyes. She didn't even try to hide it. "Why would anyone want to do that?" she asked. I didn't bother answering. At that point, I'd already learned that explaining myself to her was like talking to the wind. She liked being loud. She liked being seen. I liked breathing quietly without giving anyone more to aim at. In our house, loud won every time. Loud got the last piece of pie. Loud got the best seat in the car. Loud was celebrated. Quiet was tolerated. I spent my weekends running along the shoreline with my sneakers full of sand, staring out at the ships that dotted the horizon, imagining what it would feel like to take off into the sky and leave everything behind. At 17, I applied for the Naval Academy. I told no one. Not my father, not Helena, not Brittany. I filled out every form in the quiet corner of the school library and mailed the envelope myself. The day the acceptance letter arrived, my father stood on the porch, holding the envelope like it might burn his hands. He didn't say much, just patted my shoulder and nodded. That was his way of saying he was proud. Helena said congratulations, but her tone was clinical, like she was evaluating a candidate not welcoming a daughter into the same world she served. Brittany didn't congratulate me at all. She asked if I was sure I wanted to ruin my life. That night, I sat on my bed and stared at the ceiling. The house was loud with Brittany's music, with Helena's clipped voice giving instructions about something with my father turning the television up too high. But under all of that was the silence that belonged to me. The silence where I made decisions that no one else could touch. I carried that silence with me when I left for the academy. It became my weapon, my armor, my hiding place. In flight school, they taught us how to handle a stall, how to pull a plane out of a spin without losing your head. They didn't have to teach me how to keep my breathing steady under pressure. My childhood already had. Brittany stayed behind in Norfolk. She dated local boys with bright smiles and dull dreams, posted about brunches and beach trips, and treated my absence like an inconvenience. If she ever missed me, she never said. If she ever respected what I was becoming, she made sure I never saw it. I sent postcards anyway, not for her, for my father. He kept them in a shoebox in the garage next to the tools he couldn't part with. I visited home twice a year. Each time, Brittany found a new way to remind me that in this house she was the sun and I was the shadow. When I earned my call sign years later, I didn't tell them, not out of spite, out of instinct. They wouldn't have understood. They liked noise. They liked pretty stories. They didn't know what to do with quiet truths, carved out of long nights and hard landings. By 2010, I had learned exactly who I was. I didn't need Brittany's approval. I didn't need Helena's praise. And I didn't need to be loud to take up space. But deep down, some part of me still wondered what it would feel like for them to see it, to see me, to finally understand. That question didn't go away. It just waited in the quiet. The wheels hit the runway with a thud that rattled through my ribs. I'd been gone for 12 months flying missions over water that smelled nothing like home, and yet the moment the tires screeched against Norfolk pavement, I felt the same cold weight settle behind my sternum. Homecoming is supposed to feel warm. It never did for me. It felt like stepping into a room where everyone had already decided who you were years ago, and nothing you did out there could change it. I sat in my seat while the plane taxied helmet bag under my arm, watching the familiar hangars slide past through the small oval window. The other pilots laughed and elbowed each other. They were going home to beer family hugs, barbecue smoke that meant joy. I was going home to a house where silence wore a pretty face and cruelty had a soft voice. When the stairs lowered, the Virginia air hit like a wall, heavy wet with that briny tang I'd carried in my bones since childhood. I stepped down onto the tarmac and kept my shoulders straight. Some of the ground crew waved. A few called my call sign Iron Widow, half teasing, half reverent. The nickname had followed me after that night when everything went wrong, and somehow I kept it from becoming worse. I gave them a nod, but didn't slow my pace. Home was waiting, and it never waited kindly. My father stood near the edge of the lot, hands shoved into the pockets of a windbreaker he'd probably worn since I was a teenager. His hair was grayer, but his posture hadn't changed. A retired Navy mechanic never forgets how to stand like he's still on a flight line. When our eyes met, something flickered there. Not a smile. Not words. Just that quiet, unspoken pride he never knew how to give shape to. I walked up to him, set down my bag, and for a moment, the two of us stood in that way we always had. Not hugging, not talking, just breathing the same air. "You look tired," he said finally. It was his version of welcome home. "You look the same," I answered, and that was mine. The ride from the base to the house was quiet. The radio hummed some old country station he liked, the kind of songs that sounded like they belonged to other people's memories. He drove like he always did, steady, measured, and I stared out the window watching the familiar turns glide by. The water, the warehouses, the corner store that hadn't changed since high school. When we pulled into the driveway, Brittany's car was already there. White, glossy, too clean to ever have done anything difficult. I knew that car like I knew the shape of her voice. She was always here before anyone else, making sure she was the center of whatever story was about to be told. She opened the front door before I reached the porch. Her hair looked exactly like it had at graduation, only more expensive. She leaned against the frame with a glass of something bright in her hand, smiling that same half-smile she'd mastered when we were kids. "Well, look who decided to land," she said. Her tone was light, but the edges were sharp. That was how Brittany did everything. She wrapped the blade in velvet. I could have matched it. I could have laughed and given her something easy to mock. But I didn't. I just stepped past her into the house. It smelled like lemon polish and old wood. Helena's smell. She kept this place like a staging deck, spotless and controlled. She stood at the far end of the hall, arms folded, her face unreadable. Even after all these years, she could still look like a CO inspecting her unit. Her hair had silver at the temples now, but her spine was straight as steel. "Sloane," she said. My name. No warmth, no welcome, just acknowledgement. "Commander," I answered. It wasn't mockery, it was a habit. She didn't flinch. She never did. She just studied me like I was another moving piece on a board she already understood. Behind me, Brittany's voice floated through the hall. "So, what's it like being Iron Widow?" She said it like a joke, like she was talking about some character in a movie she'd never watch. I didn't turn around. I didn't give her the reaction she wanted. "It's work," I said. Simple. Unshakable. My father carried my bag down the hall and set it in my old room. Everything in the house looked the same, but sharper, like they'd spent years polishing a life that didn't have space for me in it. Dinner that night was a theater performance. Helena asked questions that were technically polite but laced with subtext. Brittany interrupted with stories about her latest job in marketing her clients, her weekends in Virginia Beach, making sure the spotlight never drifted too far from her. My father chewed his food and let it all wash over him. The sound of silverware on plates filled the gaps where family might have been. I sat there listening, nodding when expected, feeling that old familiar detachment settle over me like fog. Out there, people said my call sign with respect. In here, it was just background noise. The next morning, I found myself in the backyard before anyone else was awake. The grass was wet with dew, the air still heavy but quiet. I stood near the fence, listening to the distant drone of aircraft from the base. Out there, I belonged to something bigger than this house. In here, I was just Sloane, the quiet one, the one they never really knew. 3 days before the barbecue, and already the air felt heavy with old habits. Helena would keep control. Brittany would talk too much. My father would say too little. And I, like always, would sit somewhere in the middle, silent. But this time, something was different. I wasn't the girl they left in the shadow. I was Iron Widow now, whether they saw it or not. And eventually, they would. The sun climbed slow that morning, pressing warm light across the windshield as I turned off Hampton Boulevard toward the base. It was the kind of morning that smelled like diesel and salt water the way Norfolk always did. My father's old truck rattled in protest as I eased it past the checkpoint. The guard recognized me, nodded once, and waved me through. I hadn't worn my uniform, didn't need to. On this side of the gate, I didn't have to explain who I was. Everyone here already knew. I parked near the commissary. Saturday mornings on base were predictable. Families shopped for the week. Kids chased each other around the parking lot. Retirees lingered near the coffee cart trading old stories like well-worn coins. It was a small world, but it belonged to me in a way my father's house never had. Inside, the fluorescent lights were too bright, the aisles too quiet, the air just a little too cold. I grabbed paper plates, charcoal plastic cups, the usual things for a barbecue no one actually wanted me to plan. Helena had insisted I not bring anything, which was exactly why I did. My hands moved on autopilot stacking supplies into the cart, while the rest of my mind wandered somewhere between boredom and calculation. I hadn't seen most of these faces in over a year, but familiarity clung to me like humidity. They saw me, they nodded. Not out of politeness, out of recognition. That was different from home. It was subtle, but real. Well, if it isn't Iron Widow. I turned at the voice and almost smiled. Chief Morales stood at the end of the aisle with that crooked grin I remembered too well. He looked the same as always, barrel-chested, tan lines etched deep from years under sun and steel. A man who'd seen everything and decided most of it was funny. "Chief," I said, shaking his hand. "You still terrorizing the new recruits? Someone has to keep them honest," he said. "What you think they can run this place without me, I don't think anyone could." I said, and his grin widened. He lowered his voice then just a touch. "I heard about your little midnight rescue." Word still gets around Archer. They still talk about that night. My chest tightened the way it always did when someone brought it up. That night had been a mess of wind, sheer burning fuel, and too many voices shouting at once. It wasn't the kind of thing you forgot. It was the kind of thing that stuck to your bones and made people look at you differently forever. "You make it sound like a party," I said. "You made it look like one he shot back." His grin softened into something quieter. "Respect. It wasn't loud, but it was there. I didn't get that look at home. I never had." "You coming to the SEAL thing later?" he asked. "What SEAL thing?" "You didn't hear. They're hosting a private gathering. Some of the guys from the liaison unit are back in town. Commander Kane will probably be there." He said Helena's name like it was just another name. "Not the woman who shaped the silence inside my house." "Of course she will," I said dry. "Word is, they're talking about the old missions." "One of them mentioned you." I raised an eyebrow. "Me?" "Yeah. Iron Widow. You think you earn a call sign like that and it disappears." "Please." He clapped me on the shoulder before walking away toward the exit. The air around me suddenly felt heavier. Helena had never acknowledged my call sign, not once. In all the years since she married my father, she had built her own silent empire inside that house, and I'd been the quiet ghost on the edges. She knew exactly who I was professionally. She'd chosen to ignore it. Outside the commissary, the breeze smelled like jet fuel. Helicopters thudded overhead, distant and familiar. I loaded the supplies into the truck and sat behind the wheel with the engine idling. It was strange sitting here where everything I'd earned actually meant something while back at the house it barely meant a whisper. Out here, people said Iron Widow with a grin, a nod, a touch of respect. At home, Brittany would say it with a smirk if she ever said it at all. That was the difference between belonging and merely existing. I gripped the steering wheel, letting my forehead rest against the back of my hand. 3 days ago, stepping off the plane, I'd told myself to get through this visit quietly, to play nice, to keep the peace. But sitting here, engine humming low, I realized something had cracked already. I wasn't that girl anymore, the one who shrank so they wouldn't feel small. I had flown too many miles, seen too many things, carried too many names of people who never came back to keep pretending. My reflection stared back from the rearview mirror. The face wasn't soft. It wasn't loud either. It was steady. One day, I thought the words forming soundlessly in my chest, "This place will remember who I am," even if they've spent years pretending not to see it. I put the truck in gear and drove back toward the neighborhood. The morning light caught the water throwing gold and silver across the bay. In a few hours, the backyard would fill with laughter and cheap beer and the performance of a family that never truly existed. Brittany would talk like she owned the world. Helena would command like she still ran missions. My father would sit and let the quiet bury everything. And me, I would stand there in plain clothes, the quiet pilot they'd written out of their story. Only this time, the story wasn't theirs to control. It was mine. The first crack had already opened. They just didn't know it yet. By the time the sun slid low enough to paint the lawn in gold, the backyard was already crowded. Cars lined the curb, voices tangled together. The smoke of the grill rose thick and sweet into the air. Norfolk's humidity clung to everything, making the air heavy and slow. I stood on the porch for a long moment before stepping out, watching the clusters of people form like small nations around the tables. Family, friends of Brittany, neighbors who never said more than a passing hello, all of them orbiting the same sun-her. Brittany's laugh cut across the yard like the sharp edge of a bell. She was standing near the grill with a wineglass in hand, her hair, perfect dress, perfectly casual but expensive. She had always known how to turn any gathering into her stage. She wasn't loud in a sloppy way. She was loud in the way people are when they believe the world is theirs by default. She held court effortlessly, talking about her marketing firm, her influencer clients, her weekends in Virginia Beach, dropping brand names like breadcrumbs for admiration to follow. Every time she tilted her glass, someone leaned closer. Every time she laughed, others laughed too. She'd mastered that art years ago. It was her crown, and this was her kingdom. I walked down the steps and felt the way eyes brushed over me. Quick, shallow. A polite smile, a nod, then back to her. Someone's aunt patted my arm and said, "You must be so tired after traveling. How long are you home for?" Someone else asked if I'd seen anything interesting out there. Interesting? That word always sat strange on my tongue. I'd seen a helicopter's engine explode mid-air. I'd seen a man's hand wrapped around the seatbelt strap while the ocean burned below. I'd seen nights so quiet the only sound was the wind slicing past the fuselage. But to them, I'd seen something interesting. I gave them the same smile I'd given them 100 times before. Tight, controlled. "Just long enough," I said. They nodded as if they understood, then drifted away to stand nearer to Brittany. She was easier to digest. I was something they didn't know how to talk to. Near the patio table, Helena stood like a queen in her quiet way. She didn't need to raise her voice to control the room. She just existed in it with authority carved into every line of her posture. Her hair was pulled back, her collared shirt crisped, the watch on her wrist glinting in the light. She wasn't the kind of woman you disobeyed without thinking twice. Even out of uniform, she wore command like a second skin. People naturally leaned toward her. She didn't dominate conversations. She steered them. She let others speak but made sure they never drifted far from her center of gravity. That was her gift. She'd built it long before she married my father. I recognized it because it was the same kind of gravity I'd flown against in missions. The difference was in the cockpit, gravity didn't smirk at you. I grabbed a soda from the cooler and stood near the fence, letting the conversations swirl around me. I didn't belong here. I never had. This house was a stage, and I was always cast as background noise. That used to sting. It didn't sting anymore. It just made everything clearer. Helena met my eyes from across the yard. For a second, neither of us moved. She didn't smile. I didn't either. It wasn't hostility. It was recognition. She knew I saw through the performance, and I knew she'd built it to last. Brittany raised her glass again. "So the new campaign is killing it," she said to her friends, her voice carrying over the music. "The brand signed with us for another year. Honestly, I might move to New York. My firm's already talking to a few names. You know how it is." Her friends, all shiny and young and loud, gasped and laughed like she was telling the most important story in the world. One of them looked at me, then at her, and asked, "Wait, isn't your sister like in the military or something?" Brittany's smile flickered just long enough for me to see it. She always hated when the spotlight shifted even slightly. "Step," she corrected lightly. "She's in the Navy. You know, paperwork meetings, that kind of thing." The laughter was soft but sharp. She didn't even look at me when she said it. She didn't have to. She knew the room would side with noise. It always had. I took a sip of the soda. The bubbles burned against my throat. "Oh, wow," one of her friends said, turning toward me like she was inspecting something curious at a museum. "That must be interesting." There it was again. Interesting. I smiled politely. "It keeps me busy." She nodded like that was the right answer and turned back to Brittany. In this family and in this yard, power didn't belong to truth. It belonged to volume, to performance, to whoever filled the air first. Helena walked past them and laid a steady hand on Brittany's shoulder. Not warm, not cold, just enough to remind her who had built the stage she performed on. Brittany straightened her posture like she always did around Helena. Everyone did. Even me once upon a time. My father was in the corner by the grill flipping burgers doing the same thing he'd done every summer since I was a kid. He didn't insert himself into the chatter. He never did. He hovered at the edges present but quiet, keeping his hands busy with something no one would thank him for. That was his way of surviving it. I understood that better than anyone. When I was a teenager, I used to think one day this family would see me for who I was, that if I just waited long enough, if I earned enough, something would shift. Standing here now, watching the way Brittany held the room, the way Helena anchored it, I knew better. This house didn't have room for two centers of gravity. They'd already chosen theirs. I could feel the old familiar pressure crawling back beneath my skin, that subtle tightening in the chest I used to mistake for shame. But this time, it wasn't shame. It was clarity. I looked around the yard at the faces I'd grown up seeing every summer. Their laughter didn't sting the way it once did. It just sounded hollow, predictable. A script they'd performed for so long they didn't even know it was a lie. Helena caught my eye again. Her head tilted slightly like she was waiting to see if I'd step into the performance or keep standing on the fence line. I didn't move. I'd spent my entire life shrinking myself to fit into their noise. Tonight, I didn't have to. The difference wasn't in them. It was in me. They just didn't know it yet. The music rose. The smell of charred meat thickened. Brittany started another story, this one about some networking dinner in D.C., something with champagne and velvet ropes. Her voice floated through the yard like it was the only thing that mattered, and everyone listened. Of course they did. That was the mask, the family mask. Loud meant truth. Quiet meant nothing. They'd built their world on that lie. But something in me was already cracking it apart. Quiet doesn't mean weak. It never did. It only waits for the right moment to speak. The light changed as the sun slipped behind the trees, turning everything gold and amber. The air had that thick end-of-day heat that stuck to your skin and slowed every breath. The yard was loud now, laughter from every corner. The clink of beer bottles, the smell of grilled meat and too much cheap cologne. Brittany was in the middle of it all like a performer stepping into her spotlight. She perched on one of the patio chairs, legs crossed, posture, perfect glass tilted elegantly in her hand. Her friends surrounded her in a loose half circle, hanging on every word. I stayed near the fence, half in the shadow of a maple tree, sipping from a bottle of water that had long since lost its chill. I could have walked away. I could have kept quiet until the night bled out. But that's the thing about people like Brittany. They never let silence live for long. She leaned back loud enough for the whole group to hear. "I mean," she said, glancing sideways at me, "she probably just pushes paperwork in some airbase somewhere." "Right, Sloane." The laughter came fast and easy like she'd rehearsed the line. She probably had. Her friends loved it. Their laughter was sharp, rehearsed, the kind that rolls in waves because no one wants to be the first to stop. Someone behind her added, "That sounds about right." "Pilot in the Navy." "Yeah, sure." The tone was full of mockery, not even bothering to hide it. It was the kind of voice people use when they think they've already won. I didn't move. I let the words hang in the warm air. I'd learned a long time ago that silence unsettles people like them more than shouting ever could. Brittany tilted her head, sensing the lack of reaction. That made her double down. "Come on, Sloane," she said, leaning forward now, voice honeyed and sharp all at once. "We're just curious. Tell us what you actually do." She was smiling, but her eyes were hard. This wasn't curiosity. This was her drawing blood in public the way she always had when she wanted to remind everyone who owned the stage. A few faces turned toward me now waiting. I could feel the weight of their stares, the mixture of smug amusement and shallow interest. They'd already decided what kind of person I was. Brittany had told them the story a long time ago. All I ever did was let her. Brittany, one of her friends, called out giggling. Maybe she's like a flight attendant or something. More laughter. Someone slapped the table. Someone else lifted their drink. It was all so predictable it almost bored me. My father looked up from the grill for half a second. His brow furrowed, then he looked away. He'd seen scenes like this too many times to stop them now. Helena stood near the edge of the group, silent. She didn't laugh. She didn't interfere either. She just watched. Her arms were crossed, her posture straight as always. Her eyes were unreadable. Brittany smiled wider, enjoying the attention. "Then tell us your call sign," she said, her tone lilting with mock challenge. "You have one right." The group laughed again. A call sign was a myth to them, something they'd seen in movies, something they didn't understand. I set the bottle down on the table beside me, slow and deliberate. My fingers didn't shake. They never did anymore. I walked forward until I was just at the edge of the patio's light and met her gaze. I didn't need to raise my voice. Iron Widow. Just 2 words. No explanation. No justification. The laughter died like someone had flicked a switch. Brittany's smile faltered, the edges softening into something uncertain. For the first time all night, her friends didn't know what to do. They looked at her, at me, back at her. What someone whispered. Helena moved then. Not much. Just a shift of her stance. Her eyes locked on mine, and in that single heartbeat, everything shifted. She knew. Of course she knew. She'd read the reports. She'd spent a lifetime close enough to the teams to know exactly what that call sign meant. The air between us changed. Her posture went rigid, like she'd just been handed classified intel in the middle of a cocktail party. Brittany blinked, caught between confusion and a growing realization that something had slipped out of her control. Her friends didn't laugh now. One of the men who'd mocked earlier leaned forward. "Wait! You're Iron Widow!" The words were soft, not mocking anymore. Just startled. My silence was answer enough. I didn't have to perform. I didn't have to prove anything. Helena took a step forward, her voice calm, measured, but carrying a weight that cut through the air like a blade. "Brittany, apologize! Now!" Every sound in the yard collapsed into stillness. Even the music seemed to fade into the background. All eyes swung toward her. Brittany's head snapped toward her mother. "What, Mom?" Now, Helena said again. Not louder, but harder. This was not a request. This was the same tone she'd probably used 100 times on deployment in briefings in situations where you didn't argue because the cost of ignoring that voice was too high. Brittany opened her mouth, closed it again. Her friends shifted uncomfortably, realizing they'd walked into something real, something none of their empty jokes could cover. I stood still, letting the silence do what it was built to do. This was the moment I had spent a lifetime not asking for, not planning for, just waiting for without realizing it. Brittany's voice came out small. "I didn't know." Her cheeks flushed red under the porch lights. "I'm sorry." I nodded once, nothing more. I didn't need to say anything else. She wasn't apologizing to make it right. She was apologizing because for the first time she wasn't the loudest person in the room. Helena's gaze lingered on me for a heartbeat longer before she turned back to the guests, her composure settling like armor. But something had shifted behind her eyes. She'd spent years pretending I was invisible in this house. 2 words had made that impossible. Around us, the group was still processing. A man at the far end of the table whispered the call sign again like it was a story he'd heard before. And maybe he had. People who know the Navy well usually have. Iron Widow was not the kind of name you got for filing paperwork. Brittany lowered her head slightly, her fingers tightening around the stem of her glass. I could feel the quiet stretch out sharp and clean. This wasn't the kind of silence I'd grown up with. This one was different. This was mine. This was the moment they all realized I'd never been the shadow. I'd just been waiting for the right light. Helena finally broke the silence. "Let's eat," she said. Her voice didn't tremble. It didn't need to. The power had already moved whether anyone wanted to admit it or not. I picked up my bottle again, walked back toward the fence, and watched as the night reshaped itself around me. For the first time in years, Brittany had nothing left to say. The silence after Helena's voice fell over the backyard like a sudden cold wind. One moment there had been laughter, quick, shallow, mean, and the next, nothing. Even the sizzle from the grill seemed distant. Helena didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. "Brittany, apologize. Now." Her tone was steady-clipped, the kind of tone that had once made grown men snap to attention in briefing rooms. Heads turned toward her like iron to a magnet. The weight of command radiated from her without effort, and for the first time in a long time, everyone in that yard understood that this wasn't just some family dinner. Brittany froze, half standing, glass still in her hand, the last of her smile falling away like ash. "Mom," she began, her voice thin. "Now?" Helena repeated. The single word landed like a hammer. It wasn't maternal. It was military. It was final. The guests shifted uncomfortably, looking between Brittany and Helena, between the daughter who always held the stage and the mother who had just stripped it away. A few chairs creaked. Someone coughed nervously. No one dared speak. Brittany stared at me with something new behind her eyes. Not superiority, not mockery, something smaller. Fear. She had never seen her mother turn that tone against her. Not once. I didn't move. I didn't need to. This wasn't my battle to fight. It never was. I just stood at the edge of the patio, the cool condensation from the bottle of water against my palm, and watched the performance unravel. That was when one of the older guests spoke. A man in his late 50s wearing a faded navy ball cap. His voice was calm, curious. "Wait," he said slowly, looking at Helena. Iron Widow Helena's jaw tightened just slightly. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The man leaned forward, recognition cutting through the haze of small talk. "I know that call sign, Operation Wildfall. Mogadishu 2022. Jesus, that was you." The sound of that city name cut through the air like a blade. Several heads turned toward me now, not out of politeness, but because something in the way he said it carried weight. He wasn't telling a story. He was remembering one. He looked at Brittany with something like disbelief, then back at me. "I remember hearing about that night. The helo went down tail rotor failure over the bay. The pilot stayed in the air long enough to get the crew out. 4 men walked away because of her." His words dropped into the silence like stones into still water, each one rippling outward. Brittany's face drained of color. Her friends who had been laughing minutes earlier shifted back in their seats. One of them whispered, "No way." The man gave a short, humorless laugh. "Way. Everyone on base talked about it for weeks. You don't forget a call sign like Iron Widow." His eyes softened when he looked back at me. It wasn't the glazed admiration Brittany chased at every party. It was quiet, genuine respect, the kind that doesn't need applause. Around us, the air itself seemed to change temperature. Conversations that had been loud seconds ago were gone. The people who had been mocking me now stared, their faces twisted somewhere between confusion and discomfort. The power they thought belonged to Brittany's voice had slipped quietly across the yard and landed squarely at my feet. Helena didn't move, but her eyes met mine, and in that look I saw everything she had never said out loud. She had always known. She had chosen silence. But in this moment, even she couldn't pretend anymore. Brittany swallowed hard. I didn't know she said almost to herself. Her friends didn't come to her rescue. They sat back, shrinking from the heat of the moment they'd helped build. I took a slow sip of water, letting the quiet stretch. I didn't need to say anything. My name had already been spoken for me. The old veteran leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. "Damn," he muttered softly. "You should have led with that." I almost smiled at that, but I didn't. This wasn't about proving anything. It was about the truth finally sitting in the air where everyone could see it. For years, this family had built its world on volume, on who could talk the loudest, on who could hold a room with charm and flash. But out here in this particular world, the world of call signs and operations whispered between people who'd lived them the loudest voice didn't matter. What mattered was what you'd done, what you'd carried, what you'd saved, and tonight all of them were hearing what I'd carried. Brittany lowered her glass to the table. Her hands trembled just enough for me to notice. Helena took one small step forward, her presence filling the yard. "You heard me," she said again, her voice even colder now. "Apologize." Brittany turned toward me. Her mouth opened, closed. For the first time in her life, she didn't have a rehearsed line. All she could do was stammer. I'm sorry." The apology didn't land like an olive branch. It landed like an admission. I gave a single, slow nod. Nothing more. She looked down, small and deflated, like the stage she'd stood on had been stripped out from under her. One of her friends stood abruptly muttering something about needing a drink and disappeared toward the cooler. Another shifted her chair back. The crowd was fracturing, rearranging itself around a new gravity. Not hers. Mine. My father finally looked up from the grill. His eyes met mine. Pride sat there in quiet layers, the kind he never could say out loud. I held it without looking away. For once, I didn't have to earn it. Helena straightened her shoulders. "Let's all eat," she said, voice calm again. But everyone knew the night was already changed. Brittany had ruled this house for years with laughter and shallow cruelty. But all it had taken was 2 words and 1 story to make that empire crumble like sand. I sat back down at the far end of the table. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The silence itself was victory enough. I lifted the glass of water to my lips, the condensation cool against my fingers. Around me, conversations restarted in cautious murmurs no longer orbiting around Brittany. The loudest person in the room was no longer the center of it. The veteran raised his beer in my direction, not like a toast, but like an acknowledgement between people who understood something most others didn't. I nodded back. Brittany sat hunched in her chair, staring at nothing. Helena stayed standing a little longer like a general surveying the battlefield after the last order had been given. Then she sat, but her eyes never quite left me. This was the first time in this house that I wasn't the one on the outside looking in. I was the center now. Not because I demanded it, but because it had always been mine. They just hadn't seen it before. I let the quiet settle slow and heavy, the kind of quiet that makes people uncomfortable, the kind that reminds them what they missed while they were laughing. Have you ever been underestimated only for the truth to land like a thunderclap? The laughter didn't return after the apology. The music still played low through the speakers, but it sounded faint now, like it belonged to some other evening, some other house. Brittany sat stiff in her chair, her glass untouched, her friends scattered into uneasy clusters across the yard. No one was laughing anymore. No one was asking her about New York or her marketing clients. They were whispering instead about me, about the man in the cap who had spoken my call sign like it meant something, and it did. For the first time in this house, the story wasn't hers to tell. Helena moved with quiet precision, gathering the plates, saying nothing, just letting the night reshape itself around the silence she had created. I stood at the edge of the patio watching it happen. Brittany tried to force her voice into the air again, once or twice some half-hearted joke about the heat about drinks, but no one bit. Her own friends were looking at her differently now. That kind of shift doesn't take words. It happens in posture, in glances. She knew it too. She had been the center of their orbit all night, but now every line of energy pointed elsewhere, toward the person she had spent her whole life dismissing. I saw the moment it hit her. Her shoulders stiffened, her throat bobbed as she swallowed hard. Then, without warning, she pushed back from the table so abruptly her chair screeched against the deck. "Excuse me," she said, her voice breaking halfway through the word. She didn't wait for anyone to respond. She turned on her heel and disappeared inside the house. A few of her friends shifted as if they might follow, but none of them did. Helena's voice came low and measured behind me. "Stay here." It wasn't an order this time. It was closer to a request. I watched her cross the patio toward the house, her figure straight, her head high. It wasn't a mother chasing after her daughter. It was a commander stepping into an aftermath she knew she'd helped create. The veteran who had recognized me lifted his beer toward me again, almost shy this time, like we were co-conspirators in something quiet. "Hell of a night," he muttered. "Hell of a pilot," he added under his breath. I gave a small nod. No smile. Just acknowledgement. Helena found me 15 minutes later after the guests had mostly drifted into low, cautious conversations. She didn't bring Brittany. She didn't need to. She came alone, moving slowly, the porch light catching the edges of her hair. She stopped a few feet away from me, just outside the circle of light. For a second, neither of us spoke. She had spent years looking at me like a puzzle she'd already solved. But tonight, she looked at me like someone seeing the real picture for the first time. "You should have told me," she said finally. Her voice wasn't sharp. It was softer than I'd ever heard it. I met her eyes. Would it have changed anything? Her jaw tightened. She didn't answer right away. That was answer enough. "No," she admitted. "Probably not." The quiet stretched between us long and unfamiliar. She had built this family on structure, on image, on the certainty of who stood where. I had never fit into the neat lines she drew, and she had never made room for me, not until a call sign forced her to. She exhaled slowly. "I owe you respect," she said, the words careful but honest. "More than I've given you." Tonight, that became very clear. For a moment, I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. I watched the porch light flicker faintly against the darkening sky. This wasn't an apology, not the kind Brittany had stammered. This was something rarer. Helena Kane did not hand out respect easily, not even to family. Behind her, the back door slammed. Brittany's voice rose inside the house, sharp and raw words I couldn't make out. I knew that sound. I'd grown up with it. It was the sound she made when something slipped from her hands. Helena turned her head slightly, listening. She didn't flinch. "She'll have to live with it," she said softly. "We all will." My father stepped out onto the porch, then wiping his hands on a towel, the faint smell of smoke clinging to his shirt. He looked older in that light lines carved deep around his mouth and eyes. He didn't say anything at first. He just watched us. Helena and I standing across from each other for the first time, without walls between us. His eyes met mine. There was pride there, yes, but something else too. A small weight that had sat in him for years. Guilt, maybe. Or the quiet knowledge that he had let this family keep me in the background for too long. He gave a small nod, his version of an entire speech, and went back to the grill without a word. Inside, something shattered. Glass, maybe. A door slammed. Brittany's meltdown was loud, messy, human in a way her carefully polished life never allowed in public. She had spent so long performing strength that the real version of her crumbled fast. I didn't follow. I walked to the front of the porch and sat down on the steps. The wood was warm beneath me, still holding the day's heat. Crickets filled the silence that the party had left behind. The yard was still dotted with lights, soft and gold glowing against the dark. The night smelled like char and salt. I leaned my elbows on my knees and let the weight of everything settle, not like a blow, but like something I'd carried a long time finally setting itself down. There was no triumph in this. No spike of satisfaction. Just quiet. Real quiet. The kind that didn't hurt. Inside, Brittany's sobs rose again, muffled by the walls. She would blame me. She would blame Helena. She would blame the world for not letting her keep her crown. That was who she was. But the difference now was that no one else believed in the crown anymore. I tilted my head back, staring up at the night sky, half hidden by trees. I thought of the cockpit, of the sound of wind against the fuselage at 2 a.m. when you're alone above the ocean and the world below is nothing but darkness. I'd spent years finding my place up there. I never expected to find it here at this house, at this table. But the truth had a way of forcing its way into spaces people tried to ignore. The door opened again, and Helena's voice came low from the threshold. "She's fine," she said. "Just angry." I didn't turn. She's always angry when she's not the center of the room. Helena didn't deny it. She just stood there a moment, then added, "You've carried more than any of us realized." I let the words hang in the air. It wasn't an apology, but it didn't need to be. The respect was real. That was enough. One by one, the guests began to leave. They did it quietly without much eye contact. The same people who had laughed a few hours ago now avoided my gaze, not because of shame, but because they didn't know how to meet the truth they'd mocked. The veteran in the cap was the last to leave. He gave me a small salute as he walked toward the gate. I nodded back. When the yard finally emptied, only the porch light remained. The house was quiet, except for Brittany's uneven sobs upstairs. My father stood at the edge of the yard smoking a cigarette. He thought no one saw. Helena leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, face unreadable. I sat on the porch steps, hands folded loosely, the night air brushing against my skin. I wasn't smiling. There was nothing to gloat about. But for the first time in a long time, I felt something like ease settle in my chest. Not because they finally saw me, but because I no longer cared if they did. The mask had cracked, the noise had dimmed, and in its place was something that had been waiting for years, silence that belonged to me. The ripple effect began the next morning. Brittany's world had always lived on the surface built on curated images and careful filters, and now the surface was cracked. At 8 a.m., she posted something on social media. Not a direct apology, not an admission, just a vague paragraph that smelled of self-pity and performance. Some people live to humiliate others. Some of us just want peace. But that's what happens when family turns on you. It was the kind of post designed to invite sympathy without giving context. She had always been good at that, bending a narrative to paint herself as the victim. For years it had worked. But this time, something was different. The people who'd been at that barbecue had seen the truth. The ones who hadn't were already hearing about it. Helena read the post over her morning coffee. She didn't comment. She didn't confront. She just exhaled sharply through her nose and reached for her phone. That quiet, precise movement was more dangerous than shouting. When Helena Kane decided something, she didn't announce it. She executed it. Within the hour, she'd made calls to her old liaison unit, to 2 former teammates now working with veterans associations, and to 1 journalist who occasionally covered military heroism stories on the base. She wasn't doing it for me. She was doing it because the name Iron Widow meant something real, and she was not about to let her daughter's arrogance make the family look like fools. By noon, 3 different retired SEALs who lived in the Norfolk area had commented under Brittany's post not to defend her, but to correct her narrative. They didn't mention details of the mission. They didn't need to. They just posted 3 simple words, Iron Widow speaks. To anyone in that community, those words carried weight. Meanwhile, the phone calls started. Norfolk was a military town. You couldn't throw a stone without hitting someone who'd served or loved someone who had. Word traveled fast. A few people who'd been at the barbecue talked. A few more repeated the story to others. By the second day, everyone who mattered in Brittany's carefully constructed social circle knew she had mocked a decorated Navy pilot, her own stepsister, without realizing who she was. Her friends who'd once orbited around her now began putting distance between themselves and the mess. A few unfollowed her. Others simply went silent. One of them sent her a text that she later threw across the room. "You went too far this time." Helena met me in the kitchen that afternoon. She didn't dance around it. She never did. "The story's out," she said, standing with her hands folded on the counter. Her voice was as steady as the hum of the fridge. "It's not just here. A few of the vets shared it at the Legion. Someone's probably going to call the local paper." I leaned back against the opposite counter. "You're fine with that." She gave a short, humorless laugh. "Your call sign is respected. My daughter acted like a fool. Actions have consequences. It's about time she learns that applies to her, too." I watched her for a long moment. This was the same woman who had spent years maintaining a facade of control in this family. Now, for once, she wasn't trying to protect it. "You're not doing this for me," I said quietly. She met my eyes without flinching. "No, I'm doing it because I refuse to let Brittany's ego destroy what we built in the Navy community. But if it helps set the record straight about you, too, so be it." It wasn't an apology, but it was a kind of acknowledgement I'd stopped expecting years ago. That evening, my father got a call from an old friend at the shipyard. I heard his voice rise from the living room. Not angry, just weighted with embarrassment. "Yeah, I know, believe me, I know," he said into the receiver, rubbing a hand over his face. He didn't look at me while he spoke, but I could feel the quiet shame rolling off him. He hadn't been the one mocking me, but it still fell on him. That was how this kind of thing worked in towns like ours. Everyone knew everyone. Everyone talked. By the third day, the real fallout hit Brittany. She'd been doing freelance marketing work for a small clothing brand that prided itself on being veteran-friendly. They saw the chatter online. They saw the screenshots of her comments. They heard the story because in towns like this, every story finds its way to the right ears eventually. She received an email early that morning. Contract terminated. Immediate effect. She stormed downstairs, phone in hand, red-eyed and shaking. "This is your fault," she snapped at me, her voice raw from crying. "I didn't even do anything. It was a joke." I set my mug down. "No," I said. "It was a choice. And people heard it." Her breath hitched. She looked like she wanted to claw her way out of the skin she was in. "You think you're so perfect just because you flew a stupid plane and saved some people?" I didn't raise my voice. "No, I just know who I am." She stared at me for a long, quiet moment, but there was no venom left to throw. The truth had already done the damage. She turned on her heel and disappeared back upstairs. In the following days, the story kept spreading. It wasn't headline news, but it lived in the spaces where military families talked in coffee shops and veterans' halls on base. People nodded at me on the street in a way they hadn't before. Not because they hadn't respected me, they just hadn't known. Now they did. Helena attended a small gathering at the Legion Hall that weekend. She didn't say a word to me before she left. She didn't need to. When she came home, she stopped by the porch where I was sitting and said almost grudgingly, "They know." "And they respect it." I nodded. That was enough. Meanwhile, Brittany found out what it felt like to live in the shadow she had spent years putting me in. Invitations dried up. Friends who had adored her kept their distance. Even her father, her biological father, called Helena after hearing the story from a coworker. I only caught fragments of their conversation, but the shame in his voice carried through the wall. "She mocked a Navy pilot," he said. Her own sister. His voice cracked with anger and embarrassment. The irony wasn't lost on me. Brittany had spent years trying to make me small. But she was the one shrinking now, not because I'd done anything to her, but because the truth had finally caught up. A week after the barbecue, I ran into the veteran with the ball cap at the grocery store. He tipped the brim of his hat at me. "Proud to have you here," he said simply. Norfolk wasn't a place where people forgot things like that. Brittany, on the other hand, couldn't walk into a single coffee shop without feeling the weight of eyes. She'd wanted to be the center of attention all her life. Now she had it for all the wrong reasons. The revenge, if it could even be called that, wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. It was the quiet kind that cut deeper, the kind that left nothing to argue with, just facts. And the fact was this: the girl who had mocked me now lived in the echo of her own words, and I didn't have to lift a single finger to make it happen. The wind rolled in from the bay, cutting across the flight line with its sharp salt edge. The late afternoon sun burned steady above the tarmac, washing everything in gold. I'd just finished a routine check flight, the kind that didn't make headlines, the kind that kept your hands busy and your mind clear. When I stepped out of the hangar, I saw her. Brittany stood at the edge of the chain-link fence, one hand gripping the metal like it was the only thing holding her upright. She wasn't supposed to be here. Civilians didn't just wander onto base, but she had always found ways to get what she wanted, and clearly she'd convinced someone to let her through the checkpoint. She was wearing oversized sunglasses that didn't hide how red her eyes were, her hair wind-blown, her breathing uneven. She spotted me before I could turn away. "Sloane," she said. Her voice cracked on my name. I walked toward her slowly, the kind of walk pilots adopt after years in the sun, steady, deliberate. My boots crunched against the pavement. Behind me, a pair of mechanics were closing up shop, the whine of tools fading into the wind. When I stopped in front of her, she pushed her glasses up onto her head. Her face was raw, stripped of the practiced polish she always wore like armor. She wasn't performing this time. She was unraveling. "Please," she whispered. "Can we talk?" I crossed my arms over my chest. "We're talking." She glanced around, maybe hoping I'd pull her somewhere private. I didn't move. She had chosen this stage. She could stand in it. "It's been 2 weeks," she said. 2 weeks of hell. People won't talk to me. Clients dropped me. Every time I walk into a coffee shop, someone looks at me like I kicked a puppy. I can't keep living like this." Her voice shook. She wasn't used to being on the outside of things. "I didn't mean it," she said finally. "It was a joke. Just a stupid joke. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." The wind picked up, tugging at the edges of my flight jacket. I didn't say anything. I let her words twist in the air between us. "I'm sorry," she said louder now, desperate. "I'll do anything to fix this. Please, just tell them it's fine. Tell them it was nothing. You can do that, right? You can fix this." I tilted my head, studying her. "You want me to fix what you broke?" Tears welled in her eyes. She nodded quickly. "Yes. I didn't mean to hurt you." I took a slow step closer until the sunlight caught my face and hers both. The wind tugged strands of hair loose from my bun. "Brittany," I said quietly, "I don't need your apology. I needed your respect. But that ship sailed a long time ago." She blinked as if the words themselves were a blow. "I respected you," she stammered. "I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. No. You performed above me. You talked over me. You laughed at me. You let your version of me become the only version anyone ever heard. And now that version fell apart, and you want me to save you from it." Her lip trembled. "I just want things to go back to how they were." "They won't," I said simply. The sound of a helicopter rose behind us, a low, mechanical growl that filled the air. She flinched at the noise. I didn't. I'd lived inside that sound for years. She reached for the fence between us like it could bridge the distance that words couldn't. "I don't know how to fix this," she said. "You can't," I answered. The words landed heavy but true. I wasn't cruel. I wasn't angry anymore either. That was the part she didn't understand. My silence now wasn't a wall. It was a door she no longer had the key to. For a long time, she just stood there, her breath catching her face, crumbling in the bright light. Finally, she let her hands drop from the fence. "I thought you'd at least help me," she whispered. I straightened my shoulders, feeling the weight of the sun on my face. "I spent years standing in your shadow because you liked how it made you feel. I owe you nothing." She opened her mouth again, but no sound came out. Tears spilled down her cheeks in the wind. This wasn't the public Brittany anymore. This was the girl who had never learned how to stand without applause. I didn't move toward her. I didn't offer comfort. Not because I wanted to punish her, but because forgiveness isn't owed just because someone finally feels the weight of their own actions. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and turned away, shoulders shaking. She walked down the path toward the parking lot, small against the wide, sunlit expanse of the base. I stayed where I was, watching the wind whip across the runway. There was no victory in this moment, just clarity. Some ships don't come back to port, some bridges aren't rebuilt, and some apologies arrive too late to matter. 6 months later, the hangar was dressed in flags and polished brass. The spring air carried the sharp tang of jet fuel and salt, and the entire base seemed to hum with a quiet kind of pride. The anniversary ceremony was one of those rare days when the flight line slowed down, when every rank from enlisted to officer stood shoulder to shoulder in crisp uniforms. Rows of folding chairs stretched out beneath the overhead lights, their neatness a reflection of the precision that had built this place. I stood at the edge of the stage, my dress whites immaculate, the wings on my chest catching the sunlight that cut through the open hangar doors. Outside the bay shimmered. I could see the flags snapping clean against the wind. When my name was called, the applause started slowly at first, a steady rhythm that rolled forward like a tide. Then it swelled strong and sustained. It wasn't the kind of applause you get for a show. It was the kind that came from people who understood exactly what it meant to be up here. I walked to the podium, the click of my heels echoing off the hangar floor. The moment my hands touched the wooden edges, the applause softened into silence. I let the silence breathe for a second, let it stretch until the room settled into it. That's something I'd learned in the cockpit, and in life control doesn't always come from force. Sometimes it comes from stillness. "Good morning," I began, my voice even. It carried easily through the hangar, no microphone needed. When I first stepped onto this base, I was 19. I thought I knew everything about who I was and who I wanted to be. I didn't. The Navy taught me how to fly, but more than that, it taught me how to stand when the wind's against you. The faces in the crowd blurred into a single focused weight of attention. Commanders, pilots, crew chiefs, veterans. A few of my fellow aviators gave me small nods, quiet encouragement that meant more than words. I spoke about the night that had earned me the call sign Iron Widow. Not in detail, the specifics belonged to the people who were there, but enough for those listening to understand what it cost and what it gave. We don't do this job for glory, I said. We do it because somebody has to be there when everything starts to fall apart. And when it does, the only thing that matters is whether you hold the line. As I spoke, my eyes found them in the crowd. Helena sat in the first row, not at the center, but just off to the side. She wore a simple navy suit, her posture still straight, but the edge that used to sharpen every line of her body was gone. She wasn't here as the woman who once ruled family gatherings with a careful hand. She was just Helena, retired, listening still. She caught my gaze for a second, and instead of the old coolness, she gave a small nod. It was quiet. It was real. My father stood near the row of flags, his hands folded behind his back. He wasn't the kind of man who cried, but I could see the wet shine at the corners of his eyes. He'd spent years in silence, caught between two worlds, between the daughter who carried herself through fire and the stepfamily that never knew how to see her. Today there was no tension left in him, just pride, unspoken but steady. Brittany sat farther back. No designer sunglasses, no loud laughter, no entourage orbiting her like planets around the sun. She looked smaller now, quieter. Life had stripped away the pieces she once thought made her untouchable. She wasn't a villain. She never had been. Just someone who had built her identity on other people's shadows. When the applause came for me again, she didn't roll her eyes or look away. She just sat there, hands folded in her lap, listening. I continued my speech, letting the words flow, not polished like a politician's, but clean and honest the way pilots talk when they're not performing for anyone. The truth is, I said you can't always choose who believes in you, but you can keep showing up, you can keep flying, and eventually the right people see you, even the ones who didn't before. A soft laugh rippled through the crowd at that, not mocking, but warm. I let it land. When I finished, the applause rose again, louder this time, not because the words were perfect, but because they came from a place that had cost something to build. A few of my squad mates rose to their feet, then a few more. Before long, the entire room was standing. I stood behind the podium for a beat longer, taking it in. 6 months ago, I'd been the quiet presence at a barbecue easy to mock because no one in that backyard had really seen me. Now they all did. Not because I demanded it, because the truth had simply outlasted their noise. After the ceremony, people clustered around commanders, young aviators, old vets who'd spent their lives in the air or on the sea. They shook my hand, told me stories, shared their own call signs. This was a community built on respect, earned, not given. I caught Helena watching from the edge of the crowd. She didn't approach at first. She waited, giving me space, something she'd never done when I was younger. When she finally walked up, she didn't give a speech. She just said quietly, "You made this place proud." For the first time, I didn't feel the urge to defend myself. "I was always part of this place," I said. She nodded. "Yes, you were." My father joined us a moment later, resting a hand on my shoulder. He didn't need words either. His eyes said enough. Brittany lingered at the back of the hangar, near the open doors where sunlight poured in. For a long moment, she just stood there watching the crowd around me. Then she turned and walked away. Not bitter, not angry, just quiet. She wasn't part of this chapter. She didn't need to be. As the sun began to sink behind the runway, the flag snapped once more in the wind. I looked out over the hangar at the people who now knew my name long before any introduction. Legacy isn't something you force. It's what remains when the noise fades. 6 months ago, I'd stood at a barbecue table, underestimated by the loudest voice in the room. Now I stood here surrounded by the only voices that ever really mattered, and I didn't need anyone's permission to belong. I already did. The air smelled like salt and warm grass. The tide had crept in close to the rocks that edged the backyard, and the water's surface caught the glow of the late summer sun. 1 year, a full year since the night of that barbecue. I sat alone on the wooden porch, elbows resting on my knees, eyes fixed on the slow roll of the waves. The house was quiet. The kind of quiet that isn't empty, just earned. My flight jacket hung on the back of the chair next to me, still carrying the faint scent of fuel and sky. In this light, everything looked softer. The trees swayed gently, the flag near the fence stirred in the evening wind, and the hum of distant engines echoed from the base. That sound had become my life's heartbeat. For years, I thought silence meant invisibility. I thought quiet was weakness, the thing that let louder people drown you out. I had spent my entire childhood under that belief. But standing in the eye of everything that had unfolded, I finally understood the truth. Silence isn't weak. It waits. It listens. And when it finally speaks, it doesn't have to shout. The past year had carved new lines in the landscape of my life. I had flown more missions. I had spoken at ceremonies. I had built bonds with people who saw me not as a quiet shadow, but as a pilot with a name that meant something. Iron Widow was no longer just a call sign whispered in hangars. It was a story people knew, but none of it had changed me into someone loud. I stayed exactly who I'd always been, only now people were finally listening. I heard footsteps on the gravel path behind the fence. Soft, hesitant. I didn't turn around right away. I already knew who it was. Brittany stepped into view like someone stepping into the light after standing in the dark for too long. She was thinner than before, not in the physical sense, but in presence. She no longer carried herself like a person who expected the world to orbit her. She held a single envelope in her hand, folded carefully at the edges, like she'd opened and closed it more than once before deciding to come here. She stopped a few feet from the porch steps. Her eyes met mine for only a second before she lowered them. "I won't stay," she said quietly. "I just wanted to give you this." I didn't reach for the envelope. She walked up the steps, placed it gently on the porch table between us, and stepped back. There was no trembling in her hands now, no desperate need to be forgiven, just stillness. She exhaled through her nose, then said, "I don't expect anything. I just needed to say thank you." I raised an eyebrow but didn't speak. "Not for what happened," she continued, looking out at the water. "For what you didn't do. You could have humiliated me more than I humiliated you. You didn't. You let the truth do it. And that taught me something I should have learned years ago." The breeze shifted, carrying the scent of the ocean between us. For a moment, neither of us said anything. There was no apology here, no grand attempt at reconciliation. Just honesty. And maybe that was all that was left to give. Brittany turned to leave. She didn't wait for my response. She just walked down the steps, the sound of her shoes fading as she moved back toward the gate. She didn't look back, and for the first time, I didn't need her to. I sat there for a long time, the envelope untouched on the table. Eventually, I picked it up. Her handwriting was smaller now, tidier, as if she'd learned to stop performing even on paper. The letter inside was short, a few lines. A thank you, an acknowledgement, a confession of who she used to be. No pleading, no excuses. Just a truth that had taken a year to form. I folded the letter back into the envelope and slipped it beneath the old flight log on the shelf near the porch door. Some things don't need to be displayed. They just need to exist. Inside the house, the medal from that rescue mission, the one that had given me the name Iron Widow, hung on a plain wooden plaque. Not framed in gold, not surrounded by pictures or headlines. Just a small piece of metal that reminded me of everything I'd carried and everything I'd survived. I lifted it gently and hung it on the wall above the old bookshelf. Not for them. For me. I stepped back, hands resting at my sides. I wasn't proving anything anymore. The people who mattered had known all along. The rest had learned the hard way. Outside, the neighborhood was gathering near the shoreline for the summer fireworks. It was a small local tradition, nothing flashy, just a reminder that some things don't need to be big to be meaningful. I walked out onto the porch as the first soft boom echoed over the water. The sky bloomed in gold and white, the reflection shimmering across the bay. A few moments later, a pair of Navy jets passed overhead, their roar threading through the night like a heartbeat. I tilted my head back, letting the sound fill my chest. 1 year ago, I'd walked into that backyard barbecue like a quiet guest at someone else's table. Now the house I sat in was mine. My name carried its own weight, and the silence that once felt like exile now felt like freedom. In the distance, laughter rose from the beach, soft and easy. The world moved on. So did I. The fireworks kept blooming, painting the night sky with color. Each crack was followed by a heartbeat of silence. It felt fitting. Life isn't always about the noise. Sometimes it's about what stays standing after the noise fades. I didn't need an audience. The night itself was enough. As the last flare faded over the water, I closed my eyes for a second, letting the quiet sink in deep. The ones who matter already knew. The rest learned the hard way. If you've ever been underestimated, comment one word to describe how it felt when the truth finally spoke for you.